Time is 7:02. I'll call to order the City of Torrington Planning and Zoning Commission, City Council and Board of Public Safety meeting for this evening, April 20th, 2022. The meeting is either by Zoom or in person at City Hall Auditorium, room 218, 140 Main Street, Torrington, Connecticut. Instructions for Zoom are available online at www.torringtonct.org/Zoom. There's a link to join the meeting. You call in at 1-646-558-8656. Meeting ID is 795-950-7035. Passcode is 907148. Moving on to agenda item number 2, attendance. Serving on the commission this evening, in person, Jim Babinski, Donna Greco, Greg Parasino, Starley Arias, myself, Greg Mealy. Also in attendance is our city planner, Jeremy Lightford, and also the members of the Board of Public Safety. Agenda item number 3, new business, joint discussion, Planning and Zoning Commission and City Council and Board of Public Safety for cannabis regulations. Kick off there, Jeremy.
Yeah, so we left off this with our previous meeting in February and gave some time for everybody to sort of digest what we talked about and passed around information last meeting. So on the table there, on our table and on the table for the city council members is a summary of a couple of different summaries on what the other towns in the state have been doing up to this date. So in that memo, you can see there's still a lot of towns under moratorium, but we're pretty much split between banned and approved at this point for those that have actually made decisions. So that's really where we stand now statewide. I know some discussion has come up about potentially doing the about a referendum as well. As far as we've seen through our research, only 2 towns have done referendums at this point. So most towns are either outright just saying no or sending it to their planning and zoning commissions for regulation amendments. And then I guess the mayor has done the calculations on the revenue side. I don't know if you want to maybe address that.
Yeah, I think the only thing that I would add to Jeremy's memo regarding where the other municipalities across the state stand. Both Jeremy and I were doing our research separately and met about an hour ago, and both of us lighted on the same interesting tidbit of information. Stonington actually banned the establishments, and their voters overturned that decision. So I don't know where they are right now in adoption of regulations, but I did find it interesting that not only are very few of these municipalities going to referendum, but there was one town where voters actually exercised their right to petition to get it on a ballot and vote. The other piece, there was a question at the last meeting about what we could reasonably expect by way of revenue from cannabis sales on a municipal level. So we did consult with our resident experts, Still River Medical Marijuana Dispensary. They were providing us information, and this information was consistent with what other municipalities were using. So we pushed a little back and asked them to give us their methodology. So they provided us with the information that was based on a study, and the methodology is essentially that roughly 8.5% of the population over the age of 21 are consumers of marijuana, both legal and illegal. And that on average, the monthly spend per person on marijuana is about $300. So according to the US Census Bureau data that came out for the most recent decennial count, we are at about 35,000 in population. 75% of that 35,000 is 2,975. If we were to look at the $300 per month on an annual basis, that's roughly $3,600. So total projected sales would be somewhere around 12,710,000. 3% of the sales tax would roughly bring in about $300,000, 321,000. Those tax funds, that was the other question we wanted clarification as to how those tax funds can be expended. Here is the short list: streetscape improvements in the neighborhoods where the cannabis retail or cultivation sites are located, education programs or youth employment and training programs, services for individuals living in the municipality who were released from the Department of Corrections, custody, probation, or parole, mental health addiction services, youth service bureau and municipal juvenile review boards, or community civic engagement efforts. So those are the guidelines. More anecdotally, and I was trying to find some real reporting mechanism on New York or Massachusetts sites with regard to what their municipalities have been collecting. Massachusetts having been doing cannabis sales since 2016. Looking at the town of Pittsfield, which is about 45,000 in population, in the year 2020, brought in a little over $1 million in sales tax revenue, $1 million, considerably higher than this methodology is projecting. So I would say, keeping in mind also that was also as a result of the tourism, Connecticut people that will drive up to purchase in a legal location. But I would say that we could roughly estimate that would be somewhere between this $300,000 number and a $1 million number. Just certainly nothing to sneeze at. I think the other, Armand Manicia, oh, there he is, was inquiring about crime statistics. That was a little information. And I know Chief Baldwin said that he had some information that he could share with the three boards.
We only had one microphone that would stretch that far, so.
But I take this to the end. Here, push that.
Just so the folks on Zoom can actually pick
Thank
up.
you very much. Good evening, everybody. You had charged me last time we met to check what the crime statistics are for Massachusetts. Quite frankly, the crime statistics are very minimal. There hasn't been anything, no increase in crime. The only issues that they had was initially the traffic and parking issues. They did, in most of the towns didn't ensure that there was an officer hired for the first several months to ensure that there was a smooth flow of both pedestrian and vehicular traffic. The only crime that was reported to me was from Great Barrington. They had a robbery in the parking lot up there, but that was early on in the stages of this thing. I've spoken to several chiefs up there in the Massachusetts area and also spoke to a representative from the Cannabis Commission from Massachusetts. The one thing that you got to understand is that the revenue that's being brought into Massachusetts, and it is significant. Massachusetts last year's revenue was over $1 billion in marijuana revenue, which and then that 3% tax was shared amongst. Currently, they have 200 and I believe it's 200 and I got the number here. 200 retail locations are currently identified in Massachusetts. So the revenues that are taken out of that tax from Massachusetts are split up between those towns that have those dispensaries within their communities. The towns that have said no to the dispensaries are starting to backtrack and are now looking to potentially get on board to bring dispensaries into their towns. The other thing that that has to be considered is that right now Massachusetts is getting customers from both New York and Connecticut. So obviously their revenues are up. Once Connecticut goes online and once these retail organizations come online here in this state, the revenues in Massachusetts are going to come down. So, the revenue projections, the mayor is correct, somewhere around $300,000 for our city. But that's going to also depend upon how many other communities and municipalities okay or have retail establishments within their community. Those revenues can be projected to be a lot less than that if you have those situations. As far as the black market is concerned, there's always going to be a black market. The chiefs that I spoke to up in Massachusetts had indicated that most of your high school kids are still getting it illegally. They're not going to go to a retail store and purchase an ounce of marijuana, which right now in Massachusetts is going for about $340 an ounce. The cost of marijuana in Massachusetts fluctuates. It was at a high of $500 an ounce a while ago, and it's been coming down. I have charts to show the fluctuation as far as that goes. And the other issues that they're seeing is that the kids in the high schools are getting the mom and dad's marijuana and bringing it to the high school and selling that type of thing. But realistically speaking, the issues that the increase in marijuana usage has not really gone up in Mass. And we don't know if it'll really be a problem here. If you're looking at the trends, I don't think that you're going to see too much of that taking place here as well. Your marijuana smokers are who they are. If you've got 100 marijuana smokers that are looking to purchase marijuana in Torrington, and you've got 100 Torrington residents that are smoking marijuana, and they want to go buy, and we don't have a retail place, and they go to Winston, you're going to have 100 people going up to Winston. Winston's going to get that revenue, but once we get it, Winston's no longer going to get those 100 people because everybody's going to be here. Massachusetts said they don't have any sales on marijuana sales. In other words, they don't run a sale that this week you can get an ounce of marijuana for $200 if you come here. That's illegal.
I want that one free.
Up in Mass. But they don't regulate what the marijuana costs up there. Speaking to the towns, Great Barrington, Uxbridge, Mass, Pittsfield, Plymouth, Mass, Barnstable, Mass, all of them had indicated that any type of crime rate, there's been no significant issue with the crime. So,
Right.
Thank you.
Thank you.
and one more thing, the only biggest concern is the driving, and we're in a situation now where it's very difficult to identify or there's no testing right now for drug driving. Obviously right now the thing that we have is alcohol related is, we have our intoximeter, which is good. Right now we have one DRE, which is drug recognition expert. We need to get more of those to be able to identify people who are operating under the influence of marijuana. But the chiefs up there that I spoke to are concerned about the driving high. So that is an issue, and they are having a difficult time with any enforcement as far as that goes. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Yes.
How much does it cost to train officers for DRE?
It's expensive, and the problem is that there aren't as many classes that are available. DREs, it starts, there's two steps to the program. It's called, first is A-RIDE, which is a recognition of somebody that's under the influence of potentially like a narcotic or a marijuana type thing. Those officers are trained in that, but the DRE is an advanced form, which the courts recognize as it's a human intoximeter, basically is what it is. And that individual, you have to be ARE certified, which all recruits are getting right now in the academy. So they're coming out of the academy as A-RIDE certified. The DRE officer requires a travel to, I believe it's either New Mexico or Texas, where they have to go for 2 weeks training, where they actually interview and they work with individuals who are smoking the marijuana, and that's how they get their training. So the training can be expensive as far as travel, lodging. The cost of the class is not that expensive, is not that cheap either. So,
Chief, how many do you think we would need? For our town.
Right now, the state has identified, I believe, they've identified specific numbers per town and per area.
No.
I don't know, but there is a number for us.
Okay.
Right now, like I said, we have one.
Right.
The state is now mandating that DREs be brought to the scene of any accident or any type of situation where an individual is injured as a result of an accident. So that's costly because now we're going to have to bring a DRE in on overtime on quite a frequent basis. But for Torrington, I think it's somewhere around 4 or 5 DREs.
Thanks.
Okay.
Mayor, just a quick question. In regards to the tax revenue that comes in, the recipients of the programs that you discussed, are there dollars in those type of entities now that are brought in by the city currently? Where I'm going with this is if there's a dollar in the fund for X, can that get transferred out to, say, the police department into their kitty, and then that tax revenue kind of supplements that
Yeah.
fund, if you will?
The only item in this list that we have funds in our operating budget right now is the Youth Service Bureau. And in that line item in our budget is roughly $35,000. And that is a statutory obligation that we have to fund youth service bureaus. The streetscape improvements, those are, usually we'll chase a grant to get that money to do a streetscape improvement.
Well,
But
hypothetically, the 35,000 that we have in our kitty, could that transfer, for example, to the police department fund?
we
so to
could
speak?
eliminate that out of our operating budget and fund the youth service bureau entirely out of this tax revenue. And I would say that the work that the Youth Service Bureau does is really, really important work for the city. 35,000 really doesn't cover what we really need them to do. So additional revenues to that organization would be beneficial to our community.
And I guess where is the determining factor of where that fund ends up, the 3%? Who's the managing entity of, we have 300,000. Where does it get into what
So-
compartments?
The devil's always in the details when it comes to something like this. So the way the statute is written, you have to excuse me, I've had a terrible cold. The way the statute is written is the annual sales or the monthly sales are reported by the retail sales, the cannabis retailer, or if there is a sales tax on any of the cultivation that gets wholesaled over to a retailer, is self-reported to the DRS. The DRS then reports back to the municipality what the sales were, and then the municipality has to send a bill to that
Okay,
retailer.
so now you get the money.
So
the
we
city
are
coffers.
the billing agent. There's a lot of confusion as to how that happens, and how we chase after that if they're delinquent in their payments.
But after it's received, how
I
is it
think-
get divvied up?
I think that the best way to handle something like this is, it isn't general revenue. All of our budget is divided into a general revenue, which is taxes, or state grants that are sent to us for general budget purposes, or grants. I would always recommend, if we're going to pursue this, that these funds be handled as grants, held in a separate account and expended from that account exactly how they're required to be spended. And that way, if there is an audit, there's always the quick answer. It's fund number 311, this is how much came in by revenue from the cannabis sales. This is what those funds were expended on. And this is what's left over and carried forward year over year. So we also don't have anything that lapses.
So Mayor, this is a really restricted use. I mean, 1 through 6 is, like you say, it's not general fund, so you can't just use it for whatever you want.
Right.
So I have a couple more sort of pointed questions on this. Streetscape improvements and other neighborhood developments in the community where the cannabis retailer currently is located.
Mhm.
How near and how far Does that
I
mean?
know it is very vague on all of that.
They don't establish that in the statute.
Right.
So how do you police that, or how do you?
I think that those are the things that we would probably have to look at as, the council and or Board of Finance would have to determine how much of a
You don't have to
radius.
bounce that off the state. You
No,
can make, you can
I don't think
decide.
so.
Right, okay.
Torrington is 40 square miles,
Mhm.
and we, out of the gate, we get one retailer.
One
And-
retailer and one,
Right.
I guess you would call it a manufacturer, cultivator.
And
See-
after 2024, we could have two.
Yeah.
I guess we really, if we were to look at it, we could probably press the envelope a little bit and say, as long as these two, retail establishments are far enough apart, that you could probably cover a significant portion of the community for these kinds of improvements.
But I'm having a real hard time with collecting money to this number and being able to utilize it in such a narrow way.
I know.
Because I'm looking at this like none of these things except for youth services, I don't think are in your budget today.
No,
Right,
No.
so you're gonna get 321,000, let's say, or that, something near that. And you have to then start figuring out, well, how am I gonna divvy it up among these permitted uses of the money? And assuming that some are gonna get heavier than others, probably, and so you're gonna probably, instead of have 35K go to youth service bureau, you can pump that up now because you have a ton more money.
absolutely.
Right.
There could be considerable infusement of resources. When we talk about mental health and addiction services, the city of Torrington, as a distressed municipality, does have a disproportionate number of residents and citizens
Yeah.
that do struggle with mental health and
Right.
addiction,
Right.
and have a great need for those services. We don't fund them,
Right.
in the city. Could those resources potentially become available for us to hire social service providers? And could those social service workers be embedded in the police department?
Right.
Those are the
Yes.
ways I
So
think
it's
we
a-
would work our way around that.
Right, so you have a lot of creative things you can do
Yeah.
regarding this use of the money.
Yes.
I was just looking at streetscapes. I mean, as much as you put money into streetscapes, at some point it's like, okay, we've done enough. I mean, but you have a lot of opportunities here. I could see where there's benefits,
Yes.
serious benefits to some of these categories
Sure.
where we can spend the
Well,
money.
and when I look at all of our city parks, and this has been a hot topic for the council and our Park and Rec Commission of late, I could very easily see streetscape improvements and other neighborhood developments. All of those small parks and those downtown neighborhoods
Mhm.
could absolutely
Mhm.
benefit from additional resources.
Or as long as
like
we can
this.
get away with it.
And we've got,
And
we have broad categories like community civic engagement efforts. I mean, that's.
Yeah, that's.
Pretty
that-
broad.
that Keeps it wide open.
Yeah.
Let me put it this way. I would make every effort to spend every
Of course.
time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Within the guidelines.
Yeah.
And as long as there's accountability, I don't think that, that anybody's going to come and say, well, you spent, that much money in this park in one of our wealthier neighborhoods. We're a distressed municipality.
Mhm.
Almost all of our neighborhoods are
Mhm.
in need.
Mayor, you did mention, for example, you spent $1 this year, there's $2 left in the fund. Is it in fact able to be carried over and built up in a fund?
That is exactly what I would be looking to get clarification on,
Okay.
because those are the big wins.
Right.
When you can build a fund like that, and now in a neighborhood or a section of the city where the retail or a cultivation establishment exists, and there's an opportunity for us to take a blighted piece of property, take ownership of it, revitalize it. Those are the kinds of things that we would focus on. And that's not something that a mayor decides. Those are the things that, your board would be looking at, and we would be working on together, all of the members of these boards in consultation with planning and zoning. And it would definitely I could see where something like this would even be written into a plan of conservation and development.
Yep.
Those guidelines, I say it all the time. Most of the people that have been working with me on boards hear me say all the time, I love policy. I might not agree with the policy, but I love policy because it gives me the guardrails of where I need to go.
Mhm.
So I would say that if this decision to move forward and these revenues are between 3,300,000 and $1 million, let's get those guardrails set up as fast as we can and make sure that we're spending them in accordance with the regulations.
Now,
Glenn, you had a comment?
Yeah, I just wanted to kind of say something along with what Chief Baldwin said. All those numbers that haven't increased and they haven't had any trouble up in Massachusetts, that's also with like 6 stores.
Yes.
And we're only talking one here. I vision the scenario of Winston approving this like it looks like they probably will, according to the paperwork here, and putting it on the upper Winston Road. So what have we accomplished here? We've accomplished nothing. And we're spending a lot of time wondering how the city can maybe help our coffers and spend the money for the city. But at the end of the day, if we can't, what is the problem with the city taking this money and helping all these organizations that are listed here, like, in Torrington, all the mental health and addiction services and stuff. If the worst case scenario is we can't use it in our budget, but we can give it to them, that's still doing a service in this city. What is wrong with that? And that, sure, it'd be nice to be able to use it in our budget, help out somebody, but what is wrong with being able to help these organizations? If that's all we can do. I've talked to a lot of people, old and young. I'm just getting probably 75% approval, 25 not. I got a very, I'm going to be polite, horrible letter from somebody, that was against it. But, and I'm glad he gave me his opinion, and that is fine. But it's been somewhat, I'm just going to give you my opinion, it's been, why not? That was kind of what, to simplify it.
Right.
For every pro on this, there's a con. And you could debate it forever.
well, the debate surrounds legality, and that's a foregone conclusion. You're done with that. So that's what I'm saying is that, after all of the reading I did on it, I spent a lot of time looking at all the different viewpoints. The essential results of it are, for what we're staring at, it's a foregone conclusion. The Connecticut has legalized it. And now the town has to decide whether they're going to add a retail environment and potentially a growing environment. But the legal issues, not one so all the arguments that we hear in the emotional rhetoric that you get has more to do with the legal issue, and that's where that whole argument is. And I want to focus on the pragmatic piece because I can't affect what happened. What we're facing is what's been done. And now the question is, what do we do with what we're faced with? So we have an opportunity to capitalize on it, as opposed to letting our neighbor do it and have them capitalize on it and take those funds and try to use them as they've indicated they want to use them for the benefits that we can get out of mental health and all these other youth service. You can affect people's behavior that way. So when you look at what are you doing with the funds, you're using those funds in the most progressive way you can to control people's viewpoints or whether they go that way or don't go that way. It isn't a gateway drug, and it's been proven that it's not. It isn't. What is the gateway is the human experience. So where that child grew up, what that person was exposed to in their social environment, that's the gateway to whether they go to a drug and then further on from that drug. But the drug itself is not a gateway. So we have an opportunity here to take those funds and actually have an impact. I think that's my view.
I think if it ends up in our hands as the Planning and Zoning Commission, and we briefly touched upon this, I think, Jeremy, I'm speaking on the record here.
Yeah.
I think it's our job to do our due diligence in creating certain areas where this is allowed and where it's not allowed.
Mhm.
You know, obviously, we don't want this bordering a neighborhood with, you know, residential homes directly next to it type of thing. You know, and that's something.
Next to a
look at it,
school,
right,
you
next
know.
to school, churches, you know, and so forth.
Mhm.
That's probably a big factor.
I know
in this.
the state in their, the dissertation they put on, you know, I don't even remember what they call them, but there's these zones that they want them to be the particular area where we locate these retail environments. So when I looked at the East Hartford,
Yeah.
something
Well,
like that,
yeah.
they call them, but they were zones that were, ended up suffering the result of, you know, the illegal drug use.
Right, right.
So, and I don't remember the exact name of it, but the fact of the matter is when I looked at certain towns that did it, and I looked at East Hartford as an example where they accepted it and they went on with it. But you know, in their map, they did the zoning and those are the areas that they picked. And what I was confused by, not confused, but what I found to be different for us is that I'm not sure we have that area.
We do.
We do.
They identified two
Yeah.
They identified
in the
two?
city of Torrington,
Okay,
I'm blanking
South-
too.
South Main Street.
okay.
So it
Tell me,
was
what are
essentially the south end of Torrington and the downtown area.
So how does that fare with, okay, so that means that we have to, Jeremy, does that mean we have to focus on those two areas as the primary places?
No, so the distribution of the licenses through the state
Yeah.
handles, it's 50-50 split between a regular, you know, between the regular licenses and the, I'm blanking too, but it's a 50-50, so social equity applicants.
Social.
Yeah. Yeah.
But my point is, if they've identified those two zones in our cities, are we restricted to only be able to allow the retail in that environment, in those two zones?
If that's the license that the state grants.
If that's like,
Yeah.
and they're gonna, of course, lean that one.
Like I said, they're half and half, but it's distributed statewide, so that doesn't mean that that's what our license would be.
So when we look at the medical marijuana, which we cited up at, what was it called, Stillwater, I guess, up that
Yeah.
way.
Still River, yeah.
Yeah, so my understanding is he actually wants to be a retail environment. So, you know, he wants to expand his business by offering
Yeah.
both the retail and the medical. But we may not be able to do that, or
So- so we're
he'll
getting-
have to go in and
We're
apply.
trying to get clarity on whether conversions actually count towards our number, and I don't think they do, but I have to get 100%.
Number meaning how many you're allowed.
Yeah, exactly. Yep.
And did we clarify, are we allowed to, or because I said, when I read it, and I only allowed one.
Yeah, only
Okay.
one.
One
Yeah.
until
Yeah,
2024.
the state released some guidance on that. So,
Okay.
yeah.
So I think what you're talking about are the disproportionately impacted
Yes,
areas.
that's the one.
Yes,
Yes.
yeah. So in the city of Torrington, there were two, but that's a specific license.
Okay.
So,
You would need to live in that zone.
Right.
The person himself who wants to put the,
Correct.
retail. okay, the
Yeah.
applicant, okay.
Yeah. so for your board's purposes in establishing a regulation, I don't think that would be one of your guiding stars. But I do believe, you know, how far do you want to keep this from schools and
Yeah.
public parks and residential?
Well, it isn't
neighborhoods?
exclusive to that. I mean, when I looked at the
Yes.
map, you know, they had those areas listed, but they also had other areas throughout the town. So they
Mhm.
made a decision that, you know, depending on how, whatever their criteria was, but they
Yes.
chose different areas of the
Yeah.
town.
So we're looking at the retail and then basically the cultivation. So to
The
speak.
growers,
Mhm.
you know.
Can we have one and not the other, or they're going hand in hand?
So interestingly enough, in Watertown.
Watertown, yeah.
Did you read my list? Did you know that already? So in Watertown, I know as I was going through this, there's a really great map that, was it Connecticut Insider put up? I can't remember who put this map
I
up on. Yeah.
Don't remember what even the
Yeah,
website
it
was,
was.
but I just came, yeah.
It's Connecticut Insider.
It is a
Yeah,
Connecticut
Connecticut
Insider.
Insider, yeah.
You know, and you can actually, you know, hit the link to
Right.
see what towns have approved,
Yeah.
what towns are
And
banned,
they're
and what
keeping that
towns are.
updated too.
But Watertown, I was remarking on some of these. Watertown banned sales, but did approve cultivation. The other thing that I found interesting is, I think it was East Granby drafted regulations, but haven't adapted those regulations yet. They're still going through their public process. I was interested in East Granby because they seem to be taking the same approach we have been taking. Very inclusive, doing this very publicly. So anybody can tune in to this, can read the minutes of these meetings, that each one of these board members, speaks to their family and their friends and, their colleagues. So the word gets out there. But I pulled up their draft regulations and they had some very restrictive regulations. They were looking at no establishments within 1,000 feet of school, city park, church, which most of the others were 500
Around,
feet.
usually, yeah, I mean, most of them were at 500. Some had like 500 for one use, 200 for another,
Right.
Okay, I might have missed it though. So we can have one retail, we can have
Yes.
one grower.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay,
One of
so
each.
it's one of each.
Until 2024.
And
In
then what is-
2024, I believe they'll open it up and allow for two.
And for clarification, the grower sales, we get the 3% of that revenue stream also.
Okay, that's
Right.
interesting. You do?
That is my
the
understanding.
the whole,
It's
they're
wholesale.
wholesale. Yeah.
Right, those are.
It's wholesale.
Oh, wow.
So it's a lower sales price because it's
obviously.
wholesale. Yeah. But we would get the 3% on that as well.
Just a comment on the growing scenario. I was at a facility in Portland years ago, and it's like, what is that odor? There was a plant right there, and the exhaust and so forth was putting odors into the air. And it's like, to me, it was offensive because it was
Yeah.
foul smelling, at that point. So that's a consideration too of location, where if an entity such as that goes in, I think that really needs to be looked at for demographics of where it's going to end up.
If it came up to planning and zoning, there is whole sections of the state law on odor control. So
Yeah.
we could, if
I
it got to
remember-
that
I read
point.
that.
Yeah. Yeah,
And I would guess that those would be industrial sites
Mhm.
primarily.
Yeah. I think so.
Away from residential.
They're always, all the industrial sites are good neighbors.
Mm.
Nobody there.
I think that the other piece to all of this that I find interesting and hard to wrap my head around is there's also the distribution, the licenses for those people that can do the delivery. So if Torrington elected not to pursue establishments and Winston or Thomaston did, somebody may say, well, I'm not inclined to drive to Thomaston to purchase marijuana. All they need to do is any good driving distributor is going to advertise, a small surcharge for the delivery, and it can be delivered right to their door. So when we talk about, the lack of embracing the fact that it's legal is the real argument, unless that it's going to be sold in Torrington or grown in Torrington. It's going
There's
to
some
be,
other issues that we all have no control over, and that is what happens privately with a person who can grow. They have, I think, up to 5 plants they can have, or
Yep.
something like that.
sure.
So, from the standpoint of enforcement, no one's going to be able to enforce that. If that person's growing plants and marketing them, which they could easily do. I mean, so you grow a few plants and then you use it as a way to sell your drugs, and probably to illegal kids or something like that.
Mm.
So it becomes more problematic from the standpoint of you're allowing a personal use and a personal grower to do that. And really no means of ever regulating that in terms of enforcement. So there are certain things that will come out of it, just like this gifting thing that happened.
Oh my goodness.
It's like
That was
ridiculous.
crazy.
People will look for ways around the law and they'll find them until you can close them. But I think those are the smaller parts of what happens when these things take place.
Any comments from any other members this evening?
So I know it's not on your agenda to make any decision on moving forward, but I know that we keep, looking at a timeline. The moratorium goes through August of 20.
September.
It is
yeah,
September.
yeah.
And for adoption purposes, public hearings that would need to be held. I'm not sure if your board was looking for some nod from the other boards as to where they think you should be, going. Is it?
I'd like to say that I'm in favor of going ahead with it right now. I believe the moratorium was great and it's a good idea, but we don't have to hold to it. And I think at some point, it's kind of obvious that we have to take action of one sort or another. I like the idea of establishing regulations, have planning and zoning come up with regulations, uses, et cetera, all the locations and what have you. And then have a public hearing. I think the public hearing will be a good way to hear from people of the town. I mean, obviously, you're not going to get a huge number of people necessarily to show up in terms of representation for the entire population. But you'll get some people and they'll be vocal as they've always have been in public hearings, and they'll let us know how they feel about it. And I think that's another data point that will help us. But I think really the conversation regarding whether we should say no or say yes, I think we can take the next step rather than saying no or say yes, and take the next step and go ahead and, hey, this is what it would look like.
Draft some regulations.
Draft some up. This is what it would look like. What do you think? Let's talk about it.
Once we have a point where we would move forward on this board, then we work with our GIS professional in the engineering
Yeah,
office,
right.
produce some maps, produce some scenarios, start actually really diving into it. And I just think the more I look at this, the more I come down on the side of, that to exactly your point, we're going to have the public hearings at planning and zoning.
Could we start maybe just to narrow the playing field and say we're not going to referendum?
Well, that's
With
something
an
that
ultimate decision.
we can't make that decision because that's
Well,
done by the public.
And I think that I appreciate the fact that if you're going to do the public hearing, well, you have to do the public hearing.
Right.
If there's, a real barnstorming and everybody comes in and says, don't do this, that may be your sign to go back to the council and say, we really think maybe this does need to be a referendum.
Well, I don't
So
think-
instead of making that decision now,
Isn't it true, Mayor, that you can say yes to a referendum, but you can't say no?
correct? Right? Because you may go through all of this work, you may draft your regulations, do the public hearing, decide you're going to adopt the regulations, and then a petition gets circulated just as it did in Stonington.
Stonington, yeah.
Yeah, that says,
Right.
yeah, we want to put it out to the public.
And so be
So
it.
there's always,
so be
exactly,
it.
and that's the public's right.
Right.
Absolutely.
And, they'll be more informative. I mean, as I had indicated in my first meeting, is I don't want to go to a public referendum with the way they constructed and couched the questions. I thought they were absolutely worthless. And this process, that if we do it, there's just a lot more rhetoric. There's a lot more theory, conversations, background information, a lot of data points. People become educated. And I want to see a person, if they plan to go to referendum, I want to see them as highly educated as possible. So they're making the decision based on as much data that we provided as a city.
Has your board ever elected to hold 2 public hearings on adoption of regulations? And the reason I ask that is, I think when you do your first hearing, your public hearing, you're going to get some people that are paying attention. And then it's the headline in the paper the next day. And everybody's like, oh my gosh, I missed my opportunity,
Right.
to speak. I don't know if you've ever done that or if this is an option.
Yeah, I think something like this, we'd want to have it over multiple meetings.
Yeah, I think so
Yeah.
too. Yeah, I would not want to short it. I'd err on the side of it being too long.
Right.
Jim, you have any comments?
Mm-mm.
Donna?
I would just like to add, if we can get as much information out to the public
Mhm.
before any public hearing in the newspaper, sure, you say people can go online and check out our website, but if it is in black and white and in real layman's terms, as to what we have discussed tonight, what it would bring to us, how we would handle it, because I do think that there's a preconceived notion that it's bad.
Mhm.
Information from the police chief that, you know, there was an investigation into other towns and what their results are. You know, people need to have that information to digest, and
Absolutely.
more information, the better, not just at a public hearing, because people do and have said in the past about other public hearings, I didn't know what was going on, even though we publish it. It just needs
It's
to
in the
be-
newspaper, it's on social
Yeah.
media, it's on the
Right.
radio.
Right.
You know, what, we
Right.
have one woman that was complaining about. I have to
Go
cringe
ahead.
when I bring up this subject, the bulky waste situation that we're trying to
Yeah.
handle. And she's like, well, how was I supposed to know this was, you know, was done? Well, we did newspaper, we did radio, we did social media. And she said, but I don't use any of those. I don't listen to the radio. I don't read the
Yeah, which
newspaper.
is really,
So
yeah.
it's really hard to get that information out there. And that's why I'm thinking if it's a possibility that we're talking about multiple hearings,
Mhm.
at least then. And I do agree that if there are draft regulations and people can say it's 500 feet from these parks, these schools, you know, they can actually see it. I think that visual is another
Right.
thing.
Right.
We have our new Torrington alerts. We don't have a lot of people that have signed up on that. But we could put it out on the Torrington alerts. And perhaps when the tax bills go out, we can add a blurb in there so that every tax-paying person in the
Right.
city of Torrington is made aware that this discussion is happening.
I agree with Donna, that, you know, the more you have, the better off you're gonna be, you know, because you haven't shorted anything.
Right.
You know, I mean, and even at the meeting, I think if we were to do preemptively, you know, at the beginning of the meeting, Jeremy can do a summary.
Mhm.
You know, and, you know, the summary is, here's what happened at the state level, this is the legal, you know, now we're dealing with a legal environment, et cetera, et cetera. So to be pragmatic is to say, I want you to focus on what we have as an issue, not another issue that's already been decided.
Right.
That's-
And I think that if I would feel comfortable, especially if we utilize those notices through the tax bills or through a mass mailing, that everybody had an opportunity to know that the discussion was happening.
Yeah.
And those may be the very people that, if they're not happy with the outcome, can start their petition for a referendum.
Yep.
You know, and
Starley, you have
Leave it
any
up to
comments, please?
So just a quick thing about the funds. You said you would recommend treating it as a grant.
yes,
So I understand, you know, allocating some of the funds to specific programs, but would you also be entertaining proposals for new programs? If, for instance, a nonprofit that deals with mental health and addiction services comes to you with a new program, would you?
so when I suggested that we would treat them as grants, I mean grant revenue. And then how they would be expended, we would utilize a policy that is adopted and a board that decides where those would go. But absolutely, I think anything that fits within that guidance is fair game for funding.
So I think the way I'm hearing it is, unless somebody has an objection, we would go forward in maybe our May meetings with a little bit of, or in our June meetings with a little, you know, map crafting and some
Regulation.
suggested regulations, and maybe by the end of June or July, we can
Have a hearing.
have a hearing. Yep.
And the
We in
timing of
agreement?
that is perfect because the tax
agree.
bills go out in
Yep.
June.
Yeah.
So there would be
July and August.
a
would
real
maybe be a
targeted
hearing.
So we
notice.
could do it August or something.
July, I mean, if we're gonna do two
July and
hearings,
August.
we can target July and August.
Is the Board of Public Safety on board with that directive? Glenn? Yeah.
Yeah, the only thing I'll say is, you know, I appreciate being a part of this conversation, and I think, you know, it's a measured approach, and what you're gonna do is fine. You know, I just looking at it through Board of Safety, I member and speaking personally, is just making sure that I can support our police department who, you know, you look at DREs, I just found out tonight, I did not realize an injury accident, we now need a DRE to go there.
Right.
You all know budgets are tough as it is.
Right.
So I want to make sure that if this is going to go forward, that we can provide that support to our police department so
Right.
they can handle those things that they need.
And,
And that's what
the-
I'm really most worried about in the lens of this conversation.
right. And the reality of that is that whether we say yes or no to this, we still have to do that.
and that's, you
What-
took my next comment right out, so
Right.
either way, but if we are, that's important to me, and 5 DREs is not a cheap endeavor.
Whatever we present to is gonna go to the PD for comment, whatever we have for our language. So they're
Yeah.
absolutely gonna,
Absolutely.
yeah.
No, I think everyone,
Yeah.
Nothing.
all the people who have a stake in this and
Yeah.
to have a say, I think has been a good thing. And so
Yeah.
I think the city is approaching it from the right standpoint that way.
I'll also say, I think definitely you're going to have to make sure that you explain whatever points or thoughts or ideas or the information that's there. 'Cause, I'm one of those that like, but to hear it explained and get more information about it, I am at least,
I almost think those are. So for the Planning and Zoning Commission, obviously regulations, well-crafted regulations are key. But to your point, the explanation of how the revenue can be used, that's a city council discussion to discuss any of the public safety issues. So I would think that maybe we would probably start to think about an FAQ sheet, that can be posted on our website so that, as those questions come in, we're shooting off the public safety questions to Chief Baldwin or any of the questions on how the revenue is treated to our comptroller's office. So we'd be getting
also,
that.
The effect that it's had on other communities, what didn't happen, people are going to need to know. that.
Absolutely.
Right.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Right. Otherwise.
So the work that we need to do is to continue to have this joint conversation, but for the work that you need to do for regulations,
Absolutely.
you have a path forward.
Yeah, this doesn't mean we don't meet again. It just means
Right.
we're on a path to try to form some regulations and new maps, et cetera, and then we can continue the conversation.
Sounds like a reasonable approach for everybody. I have a full quorum of a Board of Safety and one council member. So when I go to the council, I'll say Armin said yes.
Okay.
So, all right, I know you have a meeting you need to start. Are we?
So what I'll do is I'll try to shoot to have something to look at by the Memorial Day holiday that we can start passing around.
Just the point you mentioned, Mayor, to maybe put a notice in the mailings for the tax bills and so forth. What's the date that those go out?
Usually the first,
July.
yeah, well,
Yeah.
usually they try to get them out before July 1st.
Right.
This year, the legislative session ends the first week of May. So as long as they don't go into an extended session, we should be able to finalize our budget and get tax bills out the first week of June. I think the latest those tax bills have ever gone out is the third week of June.
I don't know if it could be left very generic, that there's
Yes.
discussion on cannabis sales and cultivation
Keep in touch.
opportunities in Torrington, watch the website or something.
Right.
I would, in that notice, encourage them, give them the links to all of our department web pages. Encourage them to sign up for the Torrington alerts. If none of you have signed up, sign up for Torrington alerts, because then we can also push those notices out.
Sure.
So we'll do our best to get the information
So
out.
you don't need any motions from us.
No.
No.
All right.
All right.
Great.
Okay.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Time is 6:56. This meeting is
Adjourned.
adjourned.